Joining me today on the Neil Wilkins podcast is Matt Readman, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of Dark Horses, an agency that has just launched a new report called Sport in Times of Crisis. This is a really comprehensive look at modern sport and brands through the lenses of three of the most prevalent issues that we're all facing right now: politics, cost of living, and the climate. So this is going to be a very interesting journey, if you like, into a whole host of topics that are causing what you might term chaos right now for many of us, either as brand owners, agency, client side, wherever we happen to be sitting in the marketing and communications mix. This stuff is going to be very powerful and really insightful. So welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So the report, what stimulated this report? Because this is quite a profound kind of journey, I guess, in terms of all of the various kind of constituent parts of what makes up doing business today.
Yeah, it's not always the cheeriest topic as well. So apologies for talking so much about crisis, but it's really a collection of thinking that we've been doing over the last 2 years or so at Dark Horses. And we're constantly interested or fascinated by how sport and culture and society kind of interconnect. And we just felt like we're consistently writing more and more about these topics because the world was focusing more and more on these topics. And so we kind of decided this is really a sort of a culmination of sort of probably 2 years worth of thinking, really. But we've been sort of following these topics and issues and now kind of tried to put them all in one place.
So the journey kind of through this, obviously that's a lengthy period of time to be researching, strategizing and thinking. You must have seen in that period of time, based on this breadth of topics that you're focused on, you must have seen a lot of change. There must have been some fundamental trends that you've seen emerge even during that process.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we started, one of the key things we were looking at, for example, was sport and its relationship to geopolitical issues. Obviously that started off with Russia and Ukraine and looking at sports involvement in that. But in the period we've been looking and writing, literally creating this report, everything that's happening now with Israel and Gaza, that was, well before that sort of started in October. So yeah, it's constantly, it's something that's constantly evolving. But it's interesting that once you're aware of some of these themes and some of the backstory to them, it's quite easy then to see how they play out. And I think for me, that's probably one of hopefully the most interesting things that any listener will get out today is the idea of like, I'm now aware of that in a way that potentially I wasn't before, because I think quite often the way we see sport and the way we've been trained to see sport is slightly different to the reality of it. We kind of see it as something that's kind of very separate to society, something that happens on the weekend, whereas, our day-to-day jobs happen during the week, or something on the front pages of newspapers and the back pages of newspapers. But the reality is that actually sport has a much bigger influence on lots of the major issues in our day and in our lifetime than maybe we think.
It's really interesting, isn't it? I think, for some of us who have, grown up loving sport participation and being, a spectator and a whole host of different sports. And I want to get on to, whether you see differences across, a variety of sports. I think for me, I'm always kind of fascinated about that sort of interplay between, is it a business? Is it something for fitness? Is it something for entertainment? There's a whole range of different kind of elements, I guess, here, both as a participant, but also as a spectator. Do you see kind of, is there a power play going on here in terms of, sport as a participant and as a spectator? I'm just wondering here whether you see any kind of patterns here as to kind of maybe at the sort of more fundamental level of what sport actually is for society.
Yeah, I think there is some difference. Well, there is difference obviously between them, but they both have they're both powerful forces in different ways. So I think the sports we play and the sports that our countries or our local communities or our socioeconomic groups play, most of the reasons why we play those sports has been defined well before our lifetimes, and therefore participation in sport and who has access to what sport is a really interesting subject, which I would argue has as much power to widen the sort of inequalities that we see in our current sort of economic landscape at the moment. So, for example, some research in the US is showing that essentially in a cost of living crisis, what happens is that richer and middle class communities continue doing sport and poorer communities stop doing it, just cut it out of their, mainly from a budget issue, the gymnastics class that you might do once a week with your kids, or that suddenly goes because it's a excessive cost. So sports participation has the ability to separate us actually much more than we think it does. Even if it's things as simple as like fitness and running and stuff like that, there's always been divides in sports that are seen as very accessible even. But I think the real sort of powerful forces of sport come through fandom and participation. Fandom and spectatorship. That's where we start to see, the bigger, certainly on like a geopolitical level, where you start to see bigger forces at play, I'd say.
So just beginning then with, obviously there were three themes that I sort of introed this conversation with, and one of those was politics. Without, and I would always sort of declare at this stage, this is kind of politically neutral from my perspective. Be interesting to see if you have a different view there, Matt, because obviously having gone through this research, it must be quite polarizing at times for you guys in terms of producing this and what you see and kind of consume yourselves, as outputs to the research. So that would be interesting in its own right. But just from a political perspective, we've seen in recent months a lot in the media about the likes of, say, Saudi Arabia using sport as a sort of a leverage, if we could call it that, in terms of its kind of position in the global economy, because it's coming at this from a very sort of financial perspective in terms of incentivizing golf and football and tennis to, sort of some very, very, very significant major events that they're putting on there now, which, 2-3 years ago, we literally weren't even on the radar. How is that kind of, maybe as a simple example, how has that kind of been seen sort of in the research? Because, to me, this is where it becomes a little bit of a political lever at a kind of a national level. It's a much bigger thing than just sport. Sport is seen as this very attractive, very fashionable, very consumer-centric product, I guess you could say. How have you seen that come through in the research?
Yeah, well, I think in our report we separate, and probably worth kind of clarifying or making this separation now, because I'll forget to cover both other things. But there's this sort of geopolitical element. So it's how is sport being used around the world by countries for both good and bad, which has actually been happening for a long, long time. And anyone who grew up in the 80s and the boycotts of Olympics and things will understand that. But then there's also a domestic side of things as well. So sport, the impact it has internally on like domestic politics and things like, Taylor Swift and Super Bowl would be a recent example of how those two can be merge and connect. But just to answer your question directly on Saudi Arabia in particular, I think there's a few. I'm going to try and say things that's like slightly more contrarian, because saying things that people have said a million times before is less interesting to people. So yes, it's undeniably true that Saudi Arabia is a state in particular that has got atrocious human rights records. There's all sorts of issues. There's and those have all been very made very clearly and very publicly, and I support and would wholeheartedly agree with all of those. I think a few interesting things around that maybe people aren't focusing on as much. One is that there's an interesting shift, full stop, between the power in sport moving from west to east. So sport in its modern form was literally invented in the West. So there are stories about, lacrosse or football played in China, or, sports that have sort of popped up throughout history in different places. But really organized modern sport was created in the West, in Europe and the US. And as a result, we kind of feel like we have a bit of a cultural control over it. And it's not that popular, or that, doesn't sit that well with the sort of Western world, I guess, when that starts to get chipped away at a little bit. And you can see this in the kind of quite strong emotive reactions of, Live Golf, I think, was hurt so much because to the US public and US audience, because not least because of the broader political elements, but because the PGA in America stands for, like, it's a sort of symbol of American capitalism in some ways. It's a sort of like a huge commercial success story. It's a game about one winner coming out across a field of over 100, and it's something that's really sort of sits very closely to the heart of the American people. So this idea of it being ripped away from by a sort of a state that from the Middle East, like, I think is there's a kind of more emotive lens to that. But we're seeing that shift just across the board. So I'd say India and their role in becoming probably the dominant power in cricket is interesting. I think female Korean golf has become so strong, so powerful, that they probably have the dominant tour now. There's other examples in maybe Japan and rugby, but I think what's interesting, it doesn't help that the Saudi Arabia example is so as I said, so emotive, because obviously there's the wider kind of backdrop we need to be aware of, but also the fact that it does feel like a literal cultural theft in some ways of European and US kind of sporting property. So the same is true in football. It's the Saudi kind of pro league is literally taking Europe's biggest superstars in football and sort of buying them essentially and taking them over to play in Saudi Arabia. So I think that's sometimes why there's a sort of real sort of visceral emotional reaction. I'd say, like, on another point, I felt very well, to some extent. I think I felt like Qatar was a bit of a missed opportunity, because when the World Cup was hosted there, because obviously there are issues that are happening in the Middle East that we find difficult to deal with in the Western world, and our values are different. But there was an opportunity, I feel, and still is an opportunity within sport, that when you look at the bigger picture and some of the things that are happening in the world, in the Middle East at the moment, we are, and it's poignant timing of this, that we're in serious danger of, like, a major escalation in the Middle East. And what is sport's role in being able to help diffuse that situation? And if used in the right way, sport can actually effectively be really well to do that. So I think, yes, I would agree with and add to all the things that have been talked about around the negative side of what Saudi Arabia and their investment is doing. I think the two kind of caveats I would say is, one, as I said, it's quite an emotional reaction because it feels very sort of personal and painful to the West. And secondly, I think that actually, if sport was more actively, or if people thought about how can we actively use sport more to sort of help diffuse and solve some issues in the Middle East, it could actually be really effective.
Do you see an upside here? Because I think, and again, a lot of us consuming the media, and I'll talk generically about the media, that just, public kind of reporting rather than necessarily, self-reporting. We're often sort of, given this, almost spoon-fed this very, very negative narrative where everything is a challenge. Like you say, it's very much kind of sort of biased towards, the cultural norms in the country which is doing the reporting. Do you see there is actually a flip side? Because surely, looking at this, from, a very, very distant perspective and very neutrally, surely this is just evolution, isn't it? Everything evolves. We have product life cycles. We have, humans evolving. We have, literally everything on this planet, according to Darwinian theory, is kind of evolving. Is this not just seeing sport itself generically just evolving? It's just becoming something different, because it's always going to be, as society evolves. Surely sport is no different.
Yeah, I think there's I think that shift of power from west to east is, when I talk about in sport, that's not just happening in sport. Of course, that's happening economically and politically as well. Like that's, you know, um, the world is constantly changing. So yeah, totally. That sport is, part of my whole point, I guess, of this report is that sport is not something that's separate from these things that happen in the world. They're so interwoven. Therefore, it makes total sense that when the broader world starts to shift, the sport will too. And yeah, that is probably part of like sport has changed so much, and globalization was driven so much by economics and stuff within sport. So it makes total sense that sport will find in the modern world will start to sort of find a place where commercially it makes most sense for it to be, basically.
I'm interested in terms of, say, using the word technology within sport, without kind of going too deep into the technical, because you'll probably lose me on this one. But I'm just kind of curious as to whether or not you see, as part of this geopolitical kind of evolution, whether you see that a lot of this being almost accelerated by the technology. With technology, I'm thinking about some of the things like goal line VAR in football, Hawkeye, calls in tennis, for example, the amount of analysis and evaluation that goes on in rugby right now, I mean, is just incredible. I mean, you see, obviously, there's coaches on the touchline, and yet, up in the stand, you've got like half a dozen analysts, poring over every single little piece of GPS data, and the balls are now, sort of GPS tagged, so you can get every single angle and rotation of the ball, etc., etc. Are we just taking this just too far? Is it kind of just a natural evolution that technology has to go along with that leveraging of the economics, with the whole kind of development of sport? Or, is technology just kind of almost playing that game? Or is there an opportunity to revert back to the simplistic nature of, sport of old, where it was people just competing with a smile on their faces at times, and then, a drink in the bar afterwards? I mean, or is that world now gone?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think one thing that's interesting to observe about sport, I think, which is quite different to other forms of culture, is that it changes actually incredibly slowly. So I take your points on the technology and the involvement, or the increasing kind of role of technology in sport. But at the same time, if you go back 100 years, the Wimbledon final was played in exactly the same place, on the same size court by two different similar kind of people. The first, American football championship was around that same kind of period with very similar rules. And that doesn't really happen in other forms of culture. We don't listen to the same music we were listening to 100 years ago. We don't listen to the same art. So one of the reasons why sport is quite resistant to change is because we place a huge extra sense of value, I guess, on comparing to the past. So because that gives what's happening at the moment like meaning and relevance. So if this is the first person who's done this since this period, that only works if the rules of the game stay consistent. It doesn't work if you change them every year, because they don't become comparable. And in sport, we're kind of obsessed by the past. And that's why it's sometimes quite interesting when people talk about sport and future all the time. You've got to caveat that actually it's a very backward looking, and I don't mean that in terms of it's not progressive. I mean that as in literally the stories in sport always tend to look backwards, because that's where, we like to compare, Federer versus Sampras. We like to compare Messi versus Maradona. We like to do that. But it's true that now there is a lot of technology, and it's also true that a lot of that is starting to get in the way of the fan experience. And it's with VAR, it's interesting because I think what that's doing is signaling a bigger shift that's happening in sport, which is the focus on I guess the effort and the experience is much better for fans who are watching it on TV than they are in the stadium. And it's one of the things that we call out in the report around the cost of living crisis that actually fans who are going to stadia are getting like exploited quite badly in terms of not just the cost and what they've been asked to pay, but the experience they get when they see that. And if you're, at a high paying or you're a high paying, ticket holder at a big sporting event, and you're in the dark for 2 or 3 minutes because you don't know what's happening in a VAR decision, or you're sat there for 4 or 5 minutes waiting for a referee to make up their mind on something that you weren't even aware of, then actually the experience becomes quite negative. There's also that real danger that it takes away the sort of, I think, what you were getting to is that organic, instant emotional feel that you get in sport. That the ball rippling the back of the net, or the, whatever ace happening or whatever it is. That's a reaction you can only get once. And if it gets kind of repeatedly stripped away from you or taken away from you, then there's always a danger that fans start to go, well, what's the point in this? You're losing me.
So it's interesting then the way you've just described that kind of sort of in-venue experience versus the experience on screen, well, potentially at home or in a pub or something like that. Do you see, or is there any evidence coming through of this kind of almost? There could be sort of analogies here with what we're talking about in marketing now, this immersive experience with, augmented reality, when you go into a store to buy some clothes and you can literally put your camera up to the particular item, and then on screen comes all the details of where it was sourced and, the sort of carbon credentials of the supply chain and all these kinds of things to add to the kind of customer decision point there. Do you see those kinds of technologies coming into the in-venue experience? So if I'm sat up in the stand, or I'm watching the tennis match or whatever, that actually on screen, actually in the palm of my hand or on some kind of device, I can actually get access to those kinds of experiences that somebody who isn't there is going to see. So it's almost like I get the best of both worlds in location, because to me that would be much more of an immersive value as a spectator, which surely has to be the way forward, seeing these technologies are now here.
Yeah, you would have thought so, wouldn't you? And, I think for more than a decade, people have been talking about the future of the in-stadium experience and smart stadiums and highly connected stadiums and all this kind of stuff. And I don't know, there will be people in my industry who specialize in that who will disagree, I'm sure, and things, but none of that's really caught on to a point where it's being used, particularly maybe it's more so in the US, to be fair, but certainly in the UK and Europe, it's quite hard to find those experiences. And not least because there's just a very obvious technological challenge about having, 50, 60, 100,000 people all in the same place at the same time. It's very difficult to get any really good digital experiences going because, connectivity struggles as a result. But also, I just don't think people care enough. And I do think that is a problem. I think, I think the experience that fans are getting is, I don't know whether it's getting worse. I haven't got data to show that it's getting worse, but there's certainly been some high profile and very shocking examples recently of fans that have received a horrendous experience, having paid a huge amount of money. So so the last 2 Champions League finals, which is the pinnacle of European sport, probably, or domestic, club competition, European sport at least, have been complete catastrophes. Liverpool fans were tear gassed and kept out of the stadium in Paris and then blamed for the event. Man City fans in Istanbul had to walk down the last few miles of the motorway to get to the game on time. Rugby World Cup fans in the World Cup were, kept out of stadiums for queuing issues. For, imagine buying tickets 3 years in advance, paying for a trip, all that sort of stuff, and then not being able to go and see the first half of the product that you're paying for. So, yeah, there are always talks. You always see these stories about amazing little bits of technology and showcases, but actually at a mainstream mass level, no, I don't think they're really happening day in, day out, apart from ticketing. It's obviously one where technology's helped on that front. But I also think there's some worrying signs are going backwards in some of these experiences. And I think what's interesting for brands is that, and sponsors in particular, is sometimes they get in the way of that fan experience. So, sponsors will think about, oh, this is, what great activation can I do as a pop-up thing that, fans are going to love. And, you might get 1,000 fans go through it during a day. But because rights holders are so keen to protect sponsors and the thing that they bought and invested for, they can make some quite draconian and slightly like ill thought through decisions. So for example, going back to that Rugby World Cup example, one of the reasons why fans weren't being able to get into stadium fast enough was because the water from non-sponsor brands was being confiscated off them as they're trying to get in. Similarly, during the World Cup in Qatar, if you were a MasterCard holder, you couldn't buy water on a MasterCard. You had to buy a prepaid Visa card to be able to go and buy water, which just the kind of decisions that, make sense at the time, because people are like in a room going, well, we can't have MasterCards or we can't have other branded bottles of water. These people have paid so much. But fans don't care about that. They just care about the experience, and they just get left angry. So I think there are some, there have always been issues the way fans have been treated in like match situations and when there's tens of thousands of fans together. But I would like to see a better experience. And if technology can help doing that, great. But I think first and foremost, it's like just really good experiences for fans that are actually paying the most, working the hardest, and making the event what it is, basically.
You use the phrase there almost as a little bit of a throwaway, but I wanted to pick you up on it because it's a really interesting one. If it is really significant, fans don't care. That was an interesting one. Do you feel as brands, as agencies, as sports governing bodies, we're actually getting to a point where there's a danger we're going to lose the fan? Because that has economic, it has fundamental and profound impacts potentially if we don't pay attention to this. Because all the things that are coming through in the report, the things that you're describing there, they feel absolutely essential. If we think of this from a pure marketing perspective, these things are the product. These are the things that we have to offer the fan. If the fans don't turn up, or if the fans walk away, maybe it's not going to happen overnight, but over time, we've all got a fundamental problem here, haven't we, as marketers, as brand owners, sponsors, the clubs, the international bodies themselves have got a really big issue if we lose the fans. So we cannot be lazy here, can we?
No, and I think when it's fans don't care, and the way that people don't care about advertising, or people say that. Actually, people do, I think, care about advertising. They probably just don't say that it's like number one, top of their list of priorities. But the fans certainly don't care which, brand is their official water supplier of an event. But I think it'd probably be worthwhile remembering what fans do care about, because sometimes I guess it's easy to forget that too. I think, what fans have always bought into with sport is, I always say there's two things that really matter. One is the spectacle and one is the story. The spectacle is I'm there live, I got to be there, I got my selfie and this amazing, the music and the fanfare and all that kind of stuff, which is nice and important. I'm not saying it's not, but what keeps fans coming back and what keeps fans dedicating their lives to stuff is the story. It's do they actually buy into the sport? Do they care who wins or not? Is it going to ruin their weekend or not? Are they going to spend hundreds of pounds buying replica shirts and traveling across countries to support their team? That isn't about, oh, I want a nice experience. That's something quite unique to sport. It's about like very, very deep inbuilt belief systems. And they're incredibly powerful, but sometimes I think brands need to remember, like, okay, how are we enhancing that story? How do we get in our brand and our name part of that story and part of that, rather than just necessarily part of the spectacle, which can work, but it's sort of less sustainable. I think it's a bit more short-termism. But yeah.
So I think, that's an interesting one then. It's almost like encouraging us as brand owners, marketers, to not be complacent. I mean, I'm a huge advocate of always being mindful or awake to kind of what's going on. Doesn't mean necessarily you've got to sink a whole huge budget into research, but just listening and just really actively listening to the macro, the bigger stuff that some of the things that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, but also then the more kind of local things, those little micro nuances, the little details, and just really keeping on the fan. I mean, somebody would be sitting here as a marketer not in sport, but probably trying to translate this. So you could say the customer, because the fans obviously are the customer of each sport here, and actually just trying to make sure that you're balancing what you need to be doing and saying with actually what is a desirable from their perspective. I mean, a simple little example, which absolutely turned me off to a particular match I was watching. I won't say which brand it was, but there was a brand that has a very, on the billboards, the pitch side sort of displays that are now animated. They're not kind of fixed as they were back in the 70s, where, you know, you had the local painter company or you had the local, you know, cafe or whatever advertising on the hoardings there. These are kind of, you know, very, very high tech, you know, high definition displays. And there was this really, really annoying, very fast moving, almost to the level of strobing effect on this billboard. And every time there was a throw in, this brand was popping up and it was flash, 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 flash. It got to a point very, very quickly where I stopped watching the game. It was just, and I'm not, you know, averse to that kind of thing, but it was just so intrusive to the experience. I thought, I'm sorry, I can't get that. I was thinking it might just be for this part of the game, but no, it carried on and on and on. And I thought, this is all about you shouting at me as a sponsor, as an advertiser. And I thought, I'm sorry, no, this is not worth the value that I'm actually getting from watching this match. So I switched it off. Yeah. And again, there's a real reminder there, isn't there, that we've got to be so careful here.
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you said that as well. I thought it was just me that get distracted by those because I'm looking at who's advertising what. But no, I think there is a balance to all of these things. And, you know, like sponsorship it's not a new thing. Like, you know, sponsorship existed in ancient Rome to put on games and stuff like that. You know, it's like anything. It's, you know, it's helping the event happen. It's giving value to fans from that point of view. And it's probably sort of keeping other costs down. So it is great, but again, exactly like advertising, I think they're completely relatable. You know, like any advertiser can understand, the fact that you can target someone 20 times in a row using, you know, digital targeting is great, but should you do it? Are you going to alienate them and start to annoy them? So there's always a balance between those things. Yeah. But I think, you know, I think sometimes it's really difficult. I feel sorry for sponsors in some ways because these days sponsorship has become so, I guess, so sophisticated. I don't mean that in a technological way, but sophisticated in terms of like there's so many different rights that are sold that actually sponsors have so little wiggle room to actually do things that actually sometimes I can imagine that sometimes can be quite frustrating. And part of our job at Dark Horses is always when we're working with sponsors, like, okay, how do you create something that genuinely is, you know, we say break away from the field, but it's like, how do you do something that isn't the same thing that, you know, our fans have seen a million times before? Because quite often a sponsorship will be sold with an activation idea already part of it, you know, and you're just doing the same thing that the sponsor did before because that's what that sponsor did. So yeah, I think that for everyone's sake, there are a few things that can be, you know, thought about a little bit more, and across the sponsorship landscape, but not least because, yeah, you're right. Like if a sponsorship is getting in the way of a fan experience, that's a disaster. And the best sponsorships are ones that really understand what's genuinely important to fans, make sure that, which is the story, and feeling like they're emotionally part of that story too, and they're alongside them. That's the thing that's really powerful because that creates a connection between, you know, consumer brand. The whole point of trying to target people through their passions is that it creates like more of an emotional connection between you and the brand, that you actually feel like you're on the same side and you believe in the same things and want the same things. And if you take that into a broader marketing context and you're just talking about getting mental availability and just creating an emotional connection, it's a very powerful way of doing it. But it's less powerful if you're just interested in the badging and you're going to annoy people. And you're like, this is great because we're getting so dynamic and so attention grabbing that, you know, no one can be watching the game and they're going to be looking at our ads. That's not always going to work so well.
I'm interested. I'm very curious about the third of the three kind of themes that was discussed in the report. The whole idea of climate change. I mean, we're seeing this come across in, you know, loads of different industries. The one that kind of springs to mind for me is the music industry, and there are, you know, certain artists and bands, Coldplay, Billie Eilish, who are really coming out and saying, actually, there's a bigger story than actually our music here. And so whether we're going to go on tour and have the greenest, you know, lowest lowest carbon footprint tour in history, or whether we are going to be packaging our products in a completely, compostable kind of way, so that it has virtually no impact on the planet. Well, I mean, with music is a really interesting example there, which I guess has analogies in terms of performance and participation, and there's quite a few crossovers in kind of music and sport in many ways. How did the report kind of throw up the whole climate change thing? Is it seen as a big kind of almost monster or storm on the horizon, or is it something that is actually going to be favorably received? Are there things that sport is kind of leading the way in now in climate change?
No, I mean, I would argue almost the opposite. I think, this is happening right here and now. That's really obvious. This isn't something that's happening in the future. And, not least because the amount of sports fixtures that are being called off because of climate change is growing every year. And I don't mean that just at professional level. There are professional events that are being stopped because of climate change and extreme weather. But actually, domestically, every year there's more and more, football matches, rugby matches, whatever it be, cancelled. But sport is even more so than the music industry. Sport is a huge contributor to the climate crisis. I mean, this is a real problem that we need to figure out. I think football alone creates 30 million tons of CO2 a year, and that's just the events. That's not all the people traveling to them. And that's about the same as like a country the size of Denmark. So it's a significant contribution to the world's kind of climate. So that is an issue. And then there's other problems as well, like, greenwashing and sports washing are terms that get used the whole time. But there is a problem. FIFA just signed their biggest ever sponsorship deal with Aramco. So there are issues that sport can be a platform which legitimizes, or can sort of confuse the issue, I guess, to say it more diplomatically. And then sport has also got this strange connection with, we saw last summer that it's kind of got this kind of connection with the climate protester movement as well, because it's going to increasingly being targeted by climate protesters as a platform to kind of make their case, which might have been happening in the world of music, but I'm not aware of it if it has. But sporting events create a very good, visible platform to make your case if you're a climate protester, much better than hanging from a gantry on the M25. You're going to reach a lot more people, and you're going to annoy fewer people by doing it like that. So we had this huge sort of, sport became this almost like sports problems with carbon emissions. It almost became more exacerbated by these protests happening on its watch, basically on its grounds. So it's really complicated. I think the challenge is like, well, you can't, you can obviously do everything you can to make an event more responsible from that point of view. So, Paris, we've been talking about the report. It's a great example because it's set to be the greenest Olympic Games ever. And I think, but there was still, even though it's the greenest Games ever, I think the carbon emissions are sort of cut to about 1.5 million tons, whereas previous Games were about 3 million. So they kind of cut emissions by half, which is great. But I don't think sport will ever justify its existence just by being more carbon neutral or being as carbon responsible as possible. For me, I think, and this is where the Paris Games are interesting, is because I think what sport can do is start to champion a kind of cleaner, greener world and inspire people that world can exist and that there's positivity in that. So I think that and marketers will understand this. I personally am quite strongly of the point of view that there's too much, I've got to be careful how I say this, but there's too much negativity and too much of a negative balance on the way that we're communicating climate change and how we want people to change their behavior. And whilst I understand that we need to make people aware of the severity of the problem, it almost feels like a lot of the comms that people see, meaning that they lose hope and that all's doom and gloom, and we've already kind of lost essentially. And I think, there is a sort of case for, okay, we need to make the more positive side of the argument and to show people what the world could look like. And sport is a really good platform to be able to do that, because not least does it reach a lot of people. So this Olympics will reach 3 billion people. That's a lot of people to reach in 2 or 3 week period. But it's also like very much about, and I've got to be careful not to over romanticize sport, because I think that's a problem generally in society. But it is a very good way of inspiring people about what humans can achieve. In the same way that I thought, like, the COVID vaccine was a great example of what humans can achieve when we put our minds to stuff, and sport is always sort of, great stories of determination and overcoming adversity and stuff. But I think in the case of Paris, there's like a very literal example of how a city is changing because of these games. So generally what happens when a games host or city hosts Olympic Games is they build loads of infrastructure. They're left with a stadium and all these facilities that generally probably start to decay over time and probably aren't really needed by that city. There are exceptions, but that works. Paris have kind of tried to do things in a different way. They've built far fewer hotels and facilities, but they've put money investment into sort of changing the city. So thousands more kilometers of cycle paths, a cleaner river that you can hopefully be able to swim in, more trees, all these kind of things that actually will leave a different type of legacy. And I think if you're living in Paris in 10 years' time and you're seeing that this is one of the cleanest and greenest cities in the world because of the Olympic Games happened there 10 years ago, in the same way that people wander around East London now and go, wow, this area is totally different because of the Olympics that happened 10 years ago, then sport can be an amazingly powerful force in taking on what is the biggest crisis any of us will face. But I think that would be my key, having thought about it quite a lot, would be my key advice to marketers in sport around climate, is stop trying to be carbon neutral, because you're never really going to be able to do it in a way that justifies the event. If you wanted to be carbon neutral, just don't do the event. But what you can do is use that event to create a message of like hope and inspire change. And that's not just about an emotional message that just gets people to feel good for a few hours. It's actually, when you're putting on these events, how do you put in long-lasting infrastructure changes that do improve those environments? Because there is the money there to be able to, the money coming in through that sporting event can be put to good from that point of view. So I think that, it's so complicated. But I think for me, like, Paris we'll see how it goes. It'll be really interesting. But I kind of hope, the optimist in me really hopes that this will change the city, but it will also get people looking around the world going, yeah, we could do that too. And if it does that, then it's a much bigger success than just a sporting event.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such an interesting angle, isn't it? That it's what is your legacy, I think, is the key message that you're kind of advocating there. Is everybody, sponsors, brand owners, businesses, entrepreneurs, whoever, is what is your legacy? If you're leaving something that's better than doing nothing, or you're leaving something that actually improves on what we've had before, then actually you're doing the right thing. So it's not, I think you're absolutely right personally, because it isn't about just chasing the numbers and the whole carbon neutrality sort of discussion. This is all about leaving something in a better state than it was. So however you define that, that's the key, isn't it? It's about mindset and doing good. I mean, value driven, purpose led, all these kind of cliches now, all these phrases, but ultimately it's about the legacy needs to be an improvement. And I think there's a really key thing for all of us there, just to kind of be very mindful and awake to that opportunity. What would your biggest takeaway be from the whole report, those 2 years of the journey, Matt? What was the biggest thing for you that kind of surprised you, or you thought, we weren't really expecting that? Were there any kind of single takeaway that was the big one?
I think it's probably not a sort of like eureka moment. That I don't think anything in the report, well, there will be a few things, but it won't be stuff that necessarily people haven't been aware of. It's just maybe seen it in a slightly different way. And I think for me, the most important thing to understand is, like, I hate when people say, sport is a force for good, because I just think that's a really lazy assumption. Sport has been used throughout history at times to be a force for good, but it's also been used as a force for bad as well. And it's probably pretty balanced between the two, to be honest. There's a lot of negativity that's happened in the world because of sport. And I feel like we need to understand, like, okay, how do you actually use sport a bit more actively and a bit more consciously to help deal with and solve some of the problems that the world's facing at the moment, which I think is possible if people really understand how it's interacting with those things. So, when politicians say sport and politics should be kept separate, which, is quite often a thing they say, why are they saying that? Like, who does it benefit that they're saying that? Why? And the reality is that quite often those who are in the status quo is benefited by sport being not political, for example. So like if you look at generally it's progressive, more liberal movements that are trying to make change through sport that people get critical of and say sport and politics shouldn't be kept separate. Whereas actually sport is very good at continuing and promoting the status quo, like singing national anthems and all this kind of stuff. So I think my takeout would be like challenge everything. Like everything in sport happens for a reason. The sports, as I said, the sports we play, the fandom that exists today, all happened. It's all got a history. It's all got a reason why it's working today. And I think that, and I'm biased on this because it's something that I spent a large part of my life thinking about and doing, but I think generally we have a bit of a blind spot to sport as a cultural force because, as I said earlier, because I think it's seen as a recreation thing. It's literally, that's where it was born out of. It was something that was not work. And as a result, we just don't see it as being that important or that powerful sometimes. We see it as, important in our lives, but not actually in terms of changing our lives or some of the biggest issues in our lives. So I think there's, too much detail to go into now, but there's loads of examples of pretty much every single issue that you face as an individual right now, and every challenge and crisis and pressure you feel. Sport probably has some way that it interweaves with that. And if that's the case, then it's a tool that brands and marketers and anyone who's trying to get people to think or behave differently can use to change that behavior. And like I said, it sounds quite theoretical and like airy-fairy, but that can actually be very, very practical as well. If you want people to change their behavior in certain ways, then sport can actually be a unique way of getting them to do that. And there's a host of examples in the report and things that we call out about pretty much every issue, from organ donation to climate change to knife crime to domestic violence. Pretty much every single one of them has successfully used sport to hit home in a way that would have been less powerful without sport.
It's been such a journey and such a powerful experience for you, I'm sure, going through this creation of this research, but then obviously the evaluation of what the research really means. So putting people in contact with Dark Horses, with Matt Readman, to kind of keep up to date with the progress, because I understand you're doing some iterations and some updates to the report currently, because this is not a static moment, is it? This is a trending thing. So is it the Dark Horses website that people should keep in touch through?
Yeah, that's probably the best place to. There's a section on our website where we put a lot called stuff, I think, which is pretty simply explained. But it's got so a lot of this thinking, some other reports we've done. But we are sort of we have a sort of ability to have a more sort of presenting kind of version of this, and there will be a written report coming out shortly with some more consumer research as well. So
great stuff. So if you're listening to this and watching this and you're fascinated and would like to engage Matt to come and present to your board, your management team, or just get into that initial conversation, if you feel there's relevance here, then I'll be putting the links to Matt and his team in the description of this episode. Matt, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really fascinating. And as a lover and participant of sport since I was born, this has been such a good conversation. I've been really interested to kind of view it from a slightly different angle. So really, really appreciate you taking the time out today to talk to us.
Thank you, Neil. It's really great.